Hello, lovely people, and welcome to another discography deep dive. This week, it's time for Queen, the first rock band I ever actually got into. And it's a funny one to me. I was introduced to them about the age of 6 or 7 when I first became obsessed with kind of magic. And they were the first real rock bands that I ever listened to. They're one of those bands that's always been there for me, and as such, they've always felt like more part of a family of the family than a musical group. I feel like I really know Brian, Freddie, John, and Roger, as a strange and stalkerish thing as that may seem. Like all extended family members, there have been times when I've spent a lot of time with them, and there have been times where I've lost contact. There's been cyclical phases of Queen devotion in my life for sure that I can vividly remember. The first phase, which I've already discussed, around 6 years old, then the first year of high school around 10 or 11 years old, and then in early adulthood around 19 to 21. I totally immersed myself in their music around these times, but then I'd stop listening to them for years. Whilst I've always loved them from afar, something else would always come along to take my attention away. I've done a fair few of these discography deep dives now, but never really braved the band that started it all for me until this point. I feel enough time has passed now where I can look at each of the albums with a lot more objectivity. So let's get started. As always, I hope this sparks some desire in you to go back and check out Queen's music for yourself, both the hits and the deeper album cuts. As usual, I'm going to be ranking them in S, A, B, C, D, and F tier. And we start with the first debut album called Queen, 1973. A band's debut is often an accumulation of their influences before they've had time to really find their own unique voice. The influences on Queen of Hendrix, Bowie, and certainly Zeppelin are present here for sure. However, there's more to the band, even on this first album, than just aping the bands that they love. And an infectious combination of theatrical vocals and heavy guitars are already there to recognise. The songs are much less pop rock than Queen would become known for later, but you can hear the huge potential throughout this energetic opening act. My favourite track from Queen is Doing All Right, and I've given it 4 out of 5 stars, which places it in A tier. So strong start for Queen. Queen 2, 1974. Although that Marlene Dietrich inspired album cover is so iconic, so let's find it. Here it is. Bohemian Rhapsody is still a couple of years away, and we're still in formative Queen mode on their imaginatively titled Queen 2. From the opening multi-layered guitar melodies of Procession, we know we're in full-on pomp and grandeur territory. The boys have been handed the keys to the studio, and even in these early years, they make the most complex and overblown sounds that they can muster. Whilst this would work on breakthrough albums like Sheer Heart Attack and Night at the Opera, it comes off as a bit pretentious and overblown here. That isn't to say that Queen 2 doesn't have its great moments, even if it seems a bit of a step back from the debut. They flirt with increasing whimsy and fairy tale themes, but combine them with super heavy guitars and dark guttural production. It's probably the closest the band come to a Spinal Tap album, but I can't help but like it. And my favourite tune is Ogre Battle. It gets 2 out of 5 stars, so a bit of a step back from the debut, which puts it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in D tier. Sheer Heart Attack, 1974. Coming out in the same year as its predecessor, it's incredible to hear the evolution from Queen 2 to Queen 3, Sheer Heart Attack. Gone is much of the pomposity of that album, turned into a focused sound and brilliance that must have come out of them honing themselves as an unstoppable touring band in the early 70s. Whilst many of the ingredients were definitely there on the first 2 albums, it could be argued that Sheer Heart Attack is where Queen finally solidify what we all came to know and love about them later on. From the camp theatricality of Killer Queen to the blistering power of Stone Cold Crazy, this is the first all-killer, no-filler Queen album and a must for any fan of 70s rock. I've given it 5 stars, and it's an essential album, and my favourite track would be Now I'm Here. Their most iconic album next, Night of the Opera from 1975. The majority of bands who are lucky enough to reach legendary status have that one zenith album, the pinnacle of both their creative and commercial success. The album that will forever be linked to the memory of them. It might be Fleetwood Mac's Rumours, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's, or Paul Simon's Graceland, for example. For Queen, of course, their most iconic album is also thankfully one of their best, 1975's A Night at the Opera. And like Sgt. Pepper's, the overriding instrument on Night at the Opera is the studio itself, as the band create their magnum opus of multi-layered vocals and guitars to create a signature, complex, sophisticated rock sound that is still being talked about and referenced to this day. Of course, this would only be half the story if the songs weren't as great as they are. It's hard to imagine a time before songs like Bohemian Rhapsody came to be, such is the gargantuan shift in music that it created. We partly have Kenny Everett to thank for this, because the critics actually hated it at the time, and everything that Queen did until the recent retcon that they've always been the nation's musical sweethearts. And Kenny Everett was one of its earliest champions, playing it constantly on his radio show until it was taken up by others. But this isn't just a one-trick pony. My Best Friend, John's best up until this point, even if I'm a sucker for Misfire, Love of My Life and Seaside Rendezvous are all classics, with the possible exception of I'm in Love with My Car. Giving Roger tunes at this early stage does feel a bit like letting Ringo have his turn behind the mic. Sorry, Roger fans. He does get a lot better, I promise. But apart from this song, there isn't a misstep at all on this album, and it's worth all of its acknowledgement as a seminal album. My favorite track is probably You're My Best Friend, and it's of course an essential album. Where to put it? Do you know what? I'm going to get slated for this, but this is just my ranking of enjoyment of the albums. I'm going to put it slightly behind Sheer Heart Attack because I listened to that album a little bit more. A Day at the Races, the follow-up album, 1976. Where are we? There it is. Releasing A Day at the Races as a partner album to A Night of the Opera was always going to draw unfavourable comparisons to that behemoth, and it does feel like an album of B-sides as a result. This is unfair in many ways, as judged on its own merits, this isn't a bad album at all, and has some real hidden gems like Long Away and You Take My Breath Away, as well as the well-known tunes. Although Queen were commercially huge, crystallised further by stellar singles like Somebody to Love and Tie Your Mother Down, by 1976 the focus was changing to a more stripped-down sound, thanks to the emergence of punk. And they were in danger of being lumped in with the other dinosaur bands of the time with their complicated melodramatic arrangements. Thankfully, Day at the Races shows that Queen still know how to rock and deliver emotional intensity in equal measure, and there is plenty to enjoy on A Day at the Races. My favourite track would be Tie Your Mother Down, and I would put it right in the middle as a 3-star album. Certainly not a bad album. News of the World, next, 1977. Whilst Roger Taylor takes the piss out of the punk craze on Sheer Heart Attack with lyrics like I feel so inarticulate, even Queen aren't immune from that influence that was all around at the time on the much more direct and pared down sound of News of the World. Whilst albums like Night of the Opera and Day of the Races had sounded big, News of the World sets its sight on a bigger stage, with a more live and anthemic feel on stadium-filling staples like We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions. It's probably their toughest sounding album to date, with a more foot-stomping rock sound and feel. Whilst Night of the Opera is considered their ultimate classic, News of the World is probably the Queen album that I listen to the most often and the one where I have the most fun. Killer riffs, the tightest of instrumentation, and memorable songs make this an essential listen. Just don't have nightmares about that artwork. My favourite track is It's Late, and it's probably my favourite Queen album, so it's going right there in number 1. Jazz, 1978. Queen continue to try out different sounds on 1978's jazz, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't gel for me in the same way as their last few. It's an entertaining collection of songs, but lacks the drive or vision of certainly Night of the Opera or News of the World. Lyrically, it's one of their poorest albums as well, with Freddie and Brian taking a leaf out of Roger, I'm in love with my car, Taylor's book, with odes to riding bikes and girls with big bums. It's hardly love of my life, is it? But you can't ignore how fun both of these songs are anyway. The cold and lightweight production that works so well on News of the World's lets Jazz's less memorable songs down for me. And although there are definitely some highlights overall, it's not one of my favorites. My favorite track would be Fat Bottom Girls, and it's a 2-star. I'm going to put it... I'm going to put it there. The Game, 1980. Queen's secret weapon, the greatest bass player in all of Christendom, Mr. John Deacon, comes to the fore on 1980's The Game and helps the band reach a whole new level of stardom, especially in America. His love of music of black origin weaves R&B elements into the mix. And unlike on Jazz, the band seem fully committed to these new sounds. They would perhaps take it too far on their next album, but on The Game, the combination of funk and a rock band firing on all cylinders makes The Game one of the most arresting Queen albums. My favorite track on it is Dragon Attack, and it's another 5-star album. I'm going to put it there. Flash Gordon, their first soundtrack album next, 1980. Queen's second album of 1980 is difficult to get excited about, really, from a creative point of view. It's a soundtrack album, after all. Whilst the single and the film itself are great fun, and the instrumentals are inventive in their use of rock guitars and synth, it feels less like a fully fledged album. My favorite track would be Battle Theme, and I've given it 2 stars, but I think it's a low 2, so I'm going to put it about there. Hot Space, 1982. Whatever you think of Queen, you've got to admire the way that they continue to reinvent and experiment with their sounds throughout the 70s and 80s. Sometimes it works wonderfully well, like on 1980's The Game, sometimes less so, like here on their most derided album of all, Hot Space. Queen take the R&B experimentation of their early 80s output and squeeze most of the life out of it, with a cold electronic sound and emaciated songs. But even with this in mind, I wouldn't call Hot Space a terrible album. There are moments of absolute brilliance on singles like Las Palabras de Amor and Under Pressure, and many of the album tracks are enjoyable if you can separate them from what you know about Queen and just appreciate them for what they are. My favorite track would be that one, Las Palabras de Amor. And although it has 2 stars, it's my favorite 2-star album, so it is going there. The Works, 1984, a bit of a return to form for Queen. After a bit of creative and commercial slump with 1982's Hot Space, Queen are back on form with their next hugely successful album, The Works. Again, the originally symphobic Queen, who previously bragged on their first few albums that no synthesizers were used, weave in more electronic sounds into their pop rock formula, but this time they find the perfect balance and the 2 elements marry perfectly. Brian May stated that his original wariness with synths was changed by hearing how much emotion and soul Stevie Wonder managed to imbue his classic 1970s albums with. And there's a lot more character to the music on The Works than its predecessor. Let me get my most controversial opinion out of the way, but Radio Gaga is one of the most interesting and exciting Queen songs up to date, until the ridiculous chorus, which totally ruins it for me. Yes, I get it. It's a satirical comment on how the once powerful media of radio has fallen on bad times, and a lover of old radio stations now finds nothing good to listen to. I get it. In this way, it's similar in theme to the equally massive hit Video Killed the Radio Star. But it just sounds so dumb and disappointing after that wonderfully synth-laden verse. Anyway, moving on. The Works is a perfect name for this album. Queen are in resilient mood, replying to the criticism from fans and critics over their change of directions on Hot Space with a testimony of, we'll show you what we're capable of. They utilize every tool in their kit, from what they've learned from their R&B and electro experimentation on The Game and Hot Space to their powerful stadium-filling rock sounds. This results in a triumphant masterclass in pop rock perfection on The Works. My favorite track on the album would be I Want to Break Free, and it's a 4-star album for me. A Kind of Magic next, 1986, where it all started for me. Coming off the back of their career-defining set at Live Aid, Queen were on top of the world again when they released 1986's A Kind of Magic. Whilst this is their second soundtrack album, with many of the songs backing the Highlander movie, it's much more of a fully fledged Queen album in comparison to the more instrumental Flash Gordon, and the songs could easily be detached from the anchor of the film. This is where Queen entered my life, so it's difficult for me to review A Kind of Magic objectively, but I'll try. Thanks to the film theme, Queen present themselves as almost superhero characters here. And for a young kid like me at the time, it was utterly infectious. However, with notable exceptions of the title track, One Vision, and possibly the most beautiful song they've ever written, Who Wants to Live Forever, A Kind of Magic is far less of a creative high point and fails to deliver the same consistent perfection of the works. It's a 3-star album for me, and my favourite track would be that one, Who Wants to Live Forever, probably my favourite Queen song of all time. 4, 3, 2. So these are all twos. Sorry. I need to move these up. I think that's still in the right order. The Miracle, 1989. 3 years is clearly a long time between albums in the 80s, as rumours started to circulate that the end of Queen was nigh by the time that they announced their next album, The Miracle, in 1989. The truth was that the band had dealt with personal issues throughout the intervening years, including Freddie finding out that he had HIV and Brian battling depression after the death of his father and an acrimonious divorce. Understandably then, Queen are in reflective mood on The Miracle, with songs that often explore their place in the grander pantheon of rock music and where they see themselves in their own history. Musically, it has that awful late 80s sheen production that makes even the most organic instruments sound like they were played on a Casio keyboard, and the overt pop sound really put me off somewhat on many of the songs. It doesn't start well with probably the worst album opener on any Queen album, The Party, which I would definitely have skipped if I wasn't being a completionist. And it doesn't improve much after that until the brilliant I Want It All, some 4 tracks in. A notable exception to the process blandness is Brian May, who's on fire with face-melting solos on the album's admittedly exciting singles Breakthrough, The Invisible Man, Scandal, and the title track, but the more lackluster album tracks hold The Miracle back from being an overall favourite of mine. My favourite track would be The Invisible Man, and I'm going to put it right about there, I think, with 2 stars. We're nearly at the end already. Innuendo, 1991. It's hard not to approach Innuendo with a certain sadness, knowing how much Freddie was having to hide and work through his suffering during its making. Unlike Made in Heaven, however, there is little signs of his illness here, apart from little hints like I'm going slightly mad, which is Freddie poking fun at his own mental degradation caused by the advancing of AIDS. And the Roger Taylor penned These Are the Days of Our Life, which Freddie injects with so much pathos and emotional experience that could only come from a man in true pain. The album starts with the title track, probably the most interesting and musically epic work they've done since Bohemian Rhapsody, interweaving sections of flamenco, theatrical pop, and heavy rock. From there on, the album never lets up, with an energy and conviction I've not heard from them since the works. This is far from the sound of a band winding down, and if anything, Innuendo is a new lease of life for the Queen. It's a shame that, for obvious reasons, they couldn't promote it more with a live audience, as this is one of their very best albums and deserves a lot more attention than it gets. A fitting end to the work of an incredible talent, Mr. Freddie Mercury. It's a 5-star album for me, and it goes rather fittingly next to A Night at the Opera, because in some ways I do see it as the 90s version of A Night at the Opera. And last up, we have Made in Heaven from 1995. Queen have always been such a life-affirming band, which only makes this tribute to recently passed Freddie Mercury all the more heartrending. Made in Heaven presents an album that was worked on whilst Freddie was dying, and finished by the rest of the band afterwards. It's incredibly poignant to think of the strength it must have taken him to sing through these songs, and all of his pain and emotion is there to hear throughout. This makes Made in Heaven a truly inspirational but heartbreaking listen. My favorite track is I Was Born to Love You, and for me, it's a 4-star album, going right about there, I would say, or there. Oh, just after Queen 1, I think. And that's it. There is one other Queen studio album, which is without Freddie. It's Queen and Paul Rodgers from 2008, The Cosmos Rocks. And what I've written about this is I wasn't sure whether to include it, but for the sake of completion, I will. I'm never sure what to make of post-Freddie Queen, to be honest. I love Brian and Roger, and I'm so glad that they continue to work together. But at the same time, without Freddie and John, who retired from Queen after Freddie's passing, it just isn't the same band to me. I'd almost have appreciated them more if they'd gone out calling themselves Smile, the name of the band that they were in before Queen. But then I will always support them to do what they want to do with the band. The songs are still too good not to be played live by the people who helped to write them. And if they are going to play them live, it might as well be if one of the best singers in the business, Bad Company and Freeze, Paul Rodgers. They were wise to go for a singer who was the polar opposite of Freddie to try and dissuade the inevitable attacks of replacement. But even though Rodgers is an undeniably talented singer, you just can't help but miss Freddie on The Cosmos Rocks, even 13 years on from Made in Heaven. Of course, none of this tells us whether The Cosmos Rocks is actually a good album or worth your time. Well, it's a perfectly serviceable rock album that I feel very little emotional connection to, and I doubt that I would listen to again. It's a 1-star album, putting it all the way down at the bottom, and my favorite track would be Small. And there we have it. Through 15 albums plus one without Freddie or John, Queen showed that they were a band who could not only create some of the most larger than life rock music ever written, but managed to stay relevant, popular, and fascinating throughout all of their different musical experimentation. Not only were they one of the most commercially successful bands of all time, they were one of the most interesting, showing that they could be equally at home with stadium-filling rockers as pushing the very edges of electronic and R&B influences, whilst retaining their character and individuality throughout. Queen were also one of those rarest things, a band whose every member was an excellent songwriter and hitmaker, as well as a superb musician in their own right. They are such a prevalent sound, even to this day, that it can be possible to miscount or underrate Queen or their importance. But I've certainly enjoyed revisiting their many excellent albums, and I hope you have enjoyed it too. Thank you very much for watching. If you've got any ideas for other bands that you'd like to hear me do a discography deep dive about, then please do comment below in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.